Consumed by envy are the learned. Corrupted by arrogance are the powerful. Destroyed by ignorance are the others. Eloquence withers with the body. Hi, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and that's a selection from the 100 stanzas of Bhartrihari, an absolutely incredible poet, one of my discoveries this year, someone I have really enjoyed spending time with. I've read through his verses a couple of times this year, and he's a man who writes about human interactions, about his desires, the desire for fame, for success. He writes about love and lust. He has a type. He also writes about disenchantment, about being able to separate oneself from the material concerns that are so transient in our existence here. And that's an actual phrase that he uses. He's an absolutely incredible mind to spend time with. I think the nearest approximation I could come to for readers who are familiar with literature and wisdom writing and poetry in the Western world would be Solomon, with the Proverbs, the Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. But Bhartrihari is really just fantastic. He was writing in the 4th century, perhaps the 5th century. I've read both his verses in this translation by Greg Bailey and also in an earlier one by Barbara Stoller Miller, and just fantastic. So I want to dive in. I want to give some more samples of his poetry from the Śatakatraya and just spend some time exploring what this great mind had to offer to us. So as I had shared, he has his second verse in the section on politics, or sometimes on politics and men, society and men. Consumed by envy are the learned, corrupted by arrogance are the powerful, destroyed by ignorance are the others. Eloquence withers with the body. And that's a theme that he's going to return to again and again. He notes in a later verse, he may forcibly extract a jewel from between a sea monster's fangs, even cross the ocean, convulsed by garlands of pulsating waves. Even a furious snake he may wear on his head as a flower, but the mind of an obstinate fool he will not please. And there's something beautifully iconoclastic, wonderfully ironic in Bhartrihari's lyrics. As much as we'll see later on, he's a man who can experience passion and experience desire. He's also someone who recognizes his place in the world and has accepted elements of that, but doesn't mind pointing out the inconsistency, perhaps, the fate that can ensnare him. He says later on, a wild elephant with a tender lotus thread he attempts to restrain. A diamond with the edge of the silk flower he equips himself to split. The saline ocean with a drop of honey he desires to make sweet. So is he who seeks ardently to guide fools with wise sayings dripping with ambrosia. And there's two elements there that I think just reveal what a wonderful poet and what a truly sage mind Bhartrihari possessed. Because we have the juxtaposition, that wonderful idea of the single thread from the flower, that he is going to hold back an elephant. The idea that you're going to take the edge of the soft flower, and all of the imagery that conjures, the religious and spiritual significance that conjures. But you're going to take that and you're going to split a diamond. Even then, we knew it was one of the hardest things, we could find here on Earth. The idea that taking a single drop of honey and dropping it in the ocean would somehow change the salty flavor of it. And he notes all of these just absurd contrasts that he's drawing, these impossible situations, are what happens when you're trying to convince someone of something and getting someone to shift. And yet, this poem itself is part of a collection that is, in a sense, wisdom literature. As much as it's romance literature and it's lyrical poetry, there's an element of wisdom to it. So Bhartrihari, he's subverting his own poetry in this beautiful, wonderful collection of images and thoughts. So that's the ironic mind that he possesses as we work through these other poems. He notes, if men have patience, what is the need of armor? If anger, what of enemies? If a kinsman, what of fire? If a good friend, what of celestial herbs? If villains, what of a snake? If impeccable knowledge, what of wealth? If modesty, what of adornments? If talent in poetry, what of a kingdom? And that's one of the themes that comes through in a number of these poems, is this idea that Bhartrihari, both in this book and then in the third book, sometimes labeled Disenchantment, He's constantly, pushing at this idea of like, why do I need these material possessions? The transient existence, as I had mentioned earlier, they're going to waste. They're going to go away. So why am I focused on those? If I have these other elements, what do I want? And yet he notes in later poems that if you have money, well, you can get quite a few of the things you want. And yet here we have another wonderful, set of concise images that really telescope and give us something special. Of water placed on heated iron, even the name is not heard of. On a lotus leaf, that same water looks like a pearl. Fallen inside the hollow of a seashell, a pearl it becomes. Of those with qualities good, middling, or bad, such are the activities. And we start to get as well elements of bitterness. A bald-headed man, his head scorched by the sun's rays, hastening to a shady spot, stood at the foot of a palm tree, and there, by a large falling fruit, his head was split open with a crack. Generally, where the victim of fate goes, there disaster follows him. And there's something beautiful and almost comical there, as he notes, if the man wasn't bald, he wouldn't have felt the heat of the sun. And then if he hadn't felt the heat of the sun, he wouldn't have moved under the tree. And if he hadn't been under the tree, the fallen fruit wouldn't have hurt him. And yet this idea that one is ensnared in this fate. And he'll have the final poem that I'll read will sort of raise a counterpoint to some of these attitudes that he has. The bondage of elephants, snakes, and birds, eclipses of the moon and sun, and the poverty of intelligent people. Observing all this, it was obvious to me. Fate is powerful. Damn. And so as we continue to read the poems, there really is, as I said, something extraordinary about how Bhartrihari is sort of working through these elements of his existence. But then we get into the passages around passion and love. And here we get something that's a little more substantial. He certainly goes into descriptions around the women that he notes. And he has a type, as I said, we'll get to that. But he also has some interesting ways in exploring the power that women have had over him and that have over his peers. Assuredly, excellent poets speak perversely, when always they declare sensuous women are truly weak. By glances from eyes motioning dramatically about, even Indra and others are defeated. How can they be weak? And there is an element of this objectification going on, but he's noting its power over him. He notes later, there may be light, may be fire, may be stars, jewels, the moon, but without my doe-eyed woman, this world has become utterly dark. And he notes as well the way that love within a marriage can be. At first strong denial, desire hardly come. Then once desire has arisen. Afterward, ashamed, her effort is relaxed, as once more her resistance is spent. Overwhelmed with love, bearing her vast yearning in secret, eager then for further love play. Intense is the happiness in stroking her body unrestrained. Love play with one's own wife is delightful. And I had mentioned that there are elements that really reminded me of the Song of Songs from Solomon. And I think the middle 100 verses, the 100 stanzas in here, really get at some of the same very intense, romantic, physical imagery. And we know he makes some of these references over time, but it's always interesting to see the images that are drawn from different cultures. So he says, face outshining the moon, eyes capable of deriding the lotus, complexion surpassing gold, hair excelling the black bee's ebony, breasts shifting fascination away from the elephant's bosses, voluptuous hips enchanting and soft of word, natural is young woman's adornment. He notes later, transient existence, the path to your end, would not be so distant, your interior so difficult to cross, were it not for those women with intoxicating eyes. But from there, he then moves into the final 100 stanzas. And of course, as Bailey notes in his introduction, and as Stoller Miller had noted in her translation, where she doesn't translate all 300, it's very evident that not all of these were probably written by the same poet. There perhaps was a school. There are some where we see a doubling that goes on. And yet there's something wonderful to see the slight variations that exist between two different poems within the same anthology, within the same collection. The organization of them is perhaps arbitrary at some point in the past. And yet it really is wonderful to appreciate the full breadth of these. And so in Disenchantment, having gone through sort of this idea around, social interaction and interaction within, a kingdom and with others, and interaction as well with romance and the desires that can be overpowering, he then starts to note, like, what is the point of all of these things? And he has a sequence of 3 here that really hit home. I have not experienced sensual pleasures. I have only experienced. I did not perform austerities. I have only suffered. Time has not elapsed. I alone have elapsed. Craving has not deteriorated. I alone have deteriorated. He hasn't lost anything. He hasn't experienced anything. He's simply slowly withered. The eloquence, the body that he withered, he mentioned withering at the very beginning, is now part of his experience in life. My face overrun with wrinkles, my head marked with gray, my limbs become flaccid. Craving alone retains its youth. The desires I had, and we know his specific desires, are still there, but he doesn't have the means to accomplish any of those now. Desire for sex has retreated. What men respect has trickled away. Esteemed friends, dear as life, gone straight to heaven. Slowly, rising with the help of a staff, eyes covered by dark clouds. Damn, even then, the stupid body is afraid of disappearing at death. And recall earlier, he had mentioned the idea of, why do I need celestial herbs if I have friends? Why do I need, these things? They'll provide me with a fire, they'll provide me with food, and yet they're all gone now. And what does that mean about his existence? Perhaps one of the darker contrasts to the 100 verses on passion and love is this one. Her breasts really just protuberances of flesh, measured against golden jars. Her face just a receptacle of phlegm, weighed against the moon. Her thigh, wet with flowing urine, rivals the cheek of a majestic elephant. But look, her despicable body is made highly prized by distinguished poets. And he himself is one of those. And there's something where he gives this juxtaposition of images where he's trying to make it seem outrageous. This description of a woman, comparable to Shakespeare, where he has sort of the mocking, subversive sonnet about how the woman of his affection is not particularly beautiful. Here we see that, and yet he still notes it's measured against golden jars, weighed against the moon, rivaling the cheek of the elephant, and made highly prized by distinguished poets. There's something about the way that even in the old age, and that everything is sort of falling apart and decaying, there is something that perhaps remains. The imagery remains. By hundreds of varieties of physical and mental pain, a man's good health is eradicated. Prosperity may be in him, but disasters fall on him like open doors, birth after birth, quickly, certainly. Death makes yourself his own. Is anything made secure by unchecked fate? A man's life is 100 years, half is gone with sleep in the night. Of the other half, another half is taken up with old age and youth. For living beings it is spent in servitude and the like, bringing with it pain, separation, and sickness. In this so unsteady, wave-like life, how can there be happiness for them? And yet he has a reply for that. As much as Bhartrihari is willing to embrace entropy, embrace the decay, embrace the sense that everything is falling and withering and just drifting apart. Vanity of vanities, as we had in Ecclesiastes, as I mentioned. Here we have a reply. You have wealth, and I too have words. It's equivalent. You are a hero. Extinction of the feverish pride of eloquence is my undying skill. Wealthy people who serve you, One also to hear me for removing blemishes in the mind. If you have no respect for me, I have absolutely no respect for you, king. And he becomes truly iconoclastic in a way that I think, as I've been able to understand from my reading, would perhaps not have been possible later on in his culture, it's like in later centuries, where he says, "What use are the Vedas, the traditional texts, reciting the Puranas and the learned treatises, utterly copious, and the flurry of activity involved in religious rituals, giving as a result heaven, which is like dwelling in a village hut, except for that alone which produces entry into the blissful abode of oneself, which is like the destructive fire destroying, the anguish-filled accoutrements, the burden of miserable existence. All else is just the posturings of merchants." He raises up this whole question around, what is the actual significance? Why am I embracing any of these beliefs that I hold or that my culture holds? And then he notes this glimmer of hope in there, and is willing to sort of toss off the rest. And I'll close with one last one. This was a favorite of a certain physicist who was the subject of a film this past summer. "He might be in the forest, in battle amid enemies, fire or water, in the great ocean or on a mountain peak, but prior meritorious deeds protect him, whether he is asleep, careless, or in difficulty." And in a sense, as much as Bhartrihari is willing to look in the shadows, be very realistic about what our lives involve, there is an element of hope. The irony is not just for the darkness, but for the light that's around the corner, creating that shadow. And that there is something to hope for, perhaps. And so, as I said, this is just absolutely wonderful. I have this selection from the Clay Sanskrit Library, which has facing Sanskrit pages and then the English translation. And as I said, this collection has all 100 poems, all 300 poems. It also has a selection by Amaru, which is quite good. Barbara Stoller-Miller's translation is a little more poetic. It's a little less literal and doesn't quite have everything. Both of these do have the fantastic Love Thief by Bílhana. That will be a whole separate video. That's an incredible, incredible text. I think there were elements that reminded me of some of my favorite poems from Speaking of Śiva, which is a great collection of sort of 10th century, 11th century poets who are working in the aftermath of Bhartrihari. And we sort of see how reading these sort of in a chronological order reveals just how other poets don't necessarily have the freedom to protest in the same way that Bhartrihari would. Later on in the 17th century, we have Tukaram, and so this is a really interesting set of poems as well, nearly over 1,000 years after Bhartrihari. I think equally and perhaps interesting with the concept of anthology, the poems of Laldad collected in I Lala are absolutely fantastic. I'll link my discussion on this video, my video discussing this text in the description box. This is just really wonderful. The Upanishads are deeply influential, certainly the Vedas as well. I think perhaps comparable would be the very popular Ruba'iyat of Omar Khayyam. Within the love poetry, I was reminded of Hafiz, just an absolutely incredible poet, Persian poet, and someone who significant this week with the longest night approaching in the northern hemisphere. And we have the poems of the late Tang, and I'll link my video discussing this text in the description box as well. These are Chinese poems from the 8th, 9th century, and these are quite incredible as well. One of the things, as I said, that I always really appreciate is that element of seeing the imagery, seeing not just the spiritual beliefs or the cultural context of the poems, but also the specific imagery that is brought up, the ideas around beauty that are brought up. I always find those quite fascinating. As I mentioned as well, certainly readers who find much to appreciate in Ecclesiastes, in the Hebrew Bible, or in Song of Songs, or the Proverbs. I think Bhartrihari is a great sort of introduction into Sanskrit poetry, into Sanskrit literature. So I hope everyone's doing well. Thanks.